Today I want to start off by sharing with you something from a colonial times in America, and that is Linsey Woolsey. I remember as a kid hearing about Linsey Woolsey. I had no idea what it is, but it turns out that Linsey Woolsey is a kind of coarse twill or plain woven fabric um, with a linen warp and a woolen weft. Warp and weft. And in colonial America, it was used because apparently there was a shortage of wool in colonial America. The coarse fabric was known in England as stuff, which was woven in Kidderminster in the 17th century, originally a wool fabric. And it may have been of this Linsey Woolsey construction later on. This name derives from a combination of lin, which is an archaic word for flax, therefore the word linen, and wool, Linsey Woolsey. This textile has been known since ancient times, and it was known as shatnez. The Hebrew Torah and Jewish law expressly forbidding us to wear it. Okay, well, if that word shatnez shows up, let's share with you Jastro's definition of shatnez. And Jastro tells us, the professor, that shatnez, first of all, it's a homotoluaton, which means it's nowhere else mentioned in the Bible, so we have no idea what the etymology is. It's a web mixed of wool and linen. Now, this is a mysterious word, shatnez. It doesn't look like a Hebrew word, and linguists have speculated that the term may come from the Coptic word sacht, which means woven, and nuj, false, or from the Arabic words shash, a black gauze, and atmuz, a strong. But none of these explanations is universally accepted, and the origin of the word remains unknown. But it comes up yesterday in our Parsha. And our Parsha states in Leviticus 19:19, in one of the two biblical verses that prohibit wearing shatnez, in both cases the references to shatnez appear within the context of other prohibitions against kilayim, mixing two species together. Look at our verse. Et chukotai tishmeru, you will observe my laws. Behemtecha lo tarbia kilayim, you shall not let your cattle mate with different species. Sodecha lo tizra kilayim, your field you shall not sow with two kinds of seeds. And now here it comes, ubeged kilayim, and cloth from a mixture of two kinds of material. And here is the word, shatnez, whatever that means, lo yale olecha, you shall not put on or wear. You should not wear this mixture, which the Torah calls shatnez. According to Chachamim, the Torah defines shatnez only as a mixing of linen made from the flax plant with wool from sheep or lambs. And the whole of the Mishnah in Kilayim is an exposition of the laws of shatnez and what is a wool, sheep, or a lamb, what is the mix. The rabbis worried that some less common fabrics like silk might be confused for flax. So they prohibited mixtures involving such materials out of fear of marasayin, that someone will see you wearing it and giving the appearance of breaking the law. But when silk became more common, the Shulchan Aruch in Yoredea 298 tells us that the concern of Marasayan disappeared. And so later legal halachic poskim eliminated these prohibitions of using silk. Now, the laws of shatnez refer only to sewing wool and linen together in the same garment. They do not restrict wearing, for instance, a wool sweater with linen pants. What are the explanations for shatnez? Let's take a look. And from reviewing the explanations, you can see very clearly that we're all struggling. So the Rambam, the Maimonides, suggests it's because of Chukas HaGoyim. We don't want to imitate the Gentiles, since shatnez clothing was worn by their heathen priests. We'll come back to this idea of priests. Because many would not agree with the Rambam, since our Kohanim were allowed to wear shatnez. There were exceptions to the rule of shatnez, one being the kahuna. And if I can show you the Pasuk in Exodus, the Pasuk clearly states, Exodus 39, Vayasu es hakotno sheish v'amase oreg la'aron ubonov. Aaron and his sons would make tunics of fine linen of woven work. Ves hamitznefes, the headdress of fine linen. So all of that is linen. Ves ha'avnef sheish mosha. So we had a mixture by the kahuna of wool and linen. So that was an exception. The Ramban, Nachmanides, tells us it's because it would appear as if man is defying that God created the world complete, and he has to kind of finish the job. Meaning there's an order to the world. There's no chaos during the 7 days of creation. We have to respect that order. And we mustn't intervene in the natural order of his universe. He brings that from, actually, a medrash in Bechukosai. In Bechukosai Teilechu. The word Bechukosai means chok. And there are two explanations, as Alan will tell you. One is a chok, meaning it's a non-rational explanation as opposed to a mishpat. Sham, Sam, chok, mishpat, we're told in Exodus. The difference between mishpat is something rational that I could understand rationally. Chok is something non-rational. Comes along the posuk in Bechukosai Teilechu, and the Medrash suggests that that is not necessarily so. Bechukosai there means the natural order in which the world was created, the planets, the sun, the moon, the stars, the seas, the shore of the seas, the sand, and the Tehom. The Medrash is telling us, in Bechukosai, you have to walk in the statutes of the natural law. I think the Ramban is suggesting that if we were going to go against the natural law, then shatnez represents that forbidden fruit. The Sefer HaChinuch, medieval, it comes to destroy the spiritual fabric of the universe, because once entangled, each item can no longer perform its original designated task in the universe as a distinct spiritual force. You can see how we're really struggling with this mixture of wool and linen. And if I can quote from the Netziv has an absolutely dazzling understanding that makes use of modern science. And the Netziv suggests the following. On the posuk, et chukosai tishmru be'emtecho kilayim lo tizra kilayim, and shatnez, he says the following. V'chein levishas shatnez. Now the Netziv is writing, Alan suggested that the telegraph was invented in the 1870s. I looked it up. In Portage, Indiana, was the first experimental use of telegraph, the use of cables to phone one another in Portage, Indiana. Can you believe it? Not some 40 miles from where I'm sitting. And he says the following: V'chein levishas shatnis, mashchis sgulas chutei tzemer, upishtim mimash yehoya b'fnei atzmo. So what you're doing is you are destroying the unique natural properties of wool and linen as to when they were uniquely by themselves. By weaving them together, what you're doing is destroying the natural properties of that. And he proves it from 19th century science. V'hu misisrei hateva v'yuduim lechochmei hateva, as this is well known, one of the secrets of science known to the scientists. Shehakosher chut shazor shel tzemer upishin. If you take a mixture of wool and linen and wrap it yachad al chut habarzel, you wrap it round one of these telegraphic poles. Pishtim yachad al chut habarzel shel ha-telegraph. As you can see, he's using that in the English sense, telegraph. Mafsik hamshochas hadibur. You can actually interrupt either the Morse code or the speech. Shenidbak merachok, shenedaber mirachok. So someone is speaking through the telegraphic pole by covering it with a thread made of twisting flax and wool together and tying it onto a telegraph pole. You will stop the wire from transmitting speech. Where would he have found such a source for such a claim about telegraph wire? Isn't the claim easily disproved by experiment? Does a telegraph wire transmit speech anyway? Maybe he meant a telephone wire? And in Cooperman's edition, all these comments are in brackets. And in the Friedman edition of the Netziv, I did not find it. But I thought that this was absolutely stunning statement from the Netziv. Very nice. The rabbis of the Talmud and later generations use shatnez as a paradigm for this chok, this non-rational law without a logical explanation. But it hasn't stopped generations of our commentators from attempting to deduce some spiritual meaning from this strange law. In the Zohar, for instance, mixing of wool and linen was a symbol of mixing the divine with impurity, or diluting the heavenly powers, as we're told in Tikkunim 109a. And in yesterday's parsha, I read in the Zohar 386 the same thing. So where do we go with this? Let's look at this exception again. The Mishnah in Kilayim chapter 9 tells us the following. There is an exception to the rule. So let's look at the exception, because from the exception we learn the rule. And the Mishnah in Kilayim says, Ein asur mishum kilayim ela tzemer pishtim. The prohibition, remember this is 2nd century Mishnah, the prohibition of kilayim, of multiple seeds together, only applies to the mixture of wool and linen. It could have applied to other kind of materials. Nope, it's only wool and linen, ve'ena metama b'negoim, etc. But there is an exception. Ein hakonim loshin l'shama beis hamikdash elot tzemer ufishtim. The exception to the rule is the kahuna, the priest who is officiating in the temple, may only wear tzemer ufishtim, from that verse in Exodus 37 that I showed you. Priests do not wear any materials to serve in the temple except for wool and linen. And Rashi brings us this wonderful medrash from Sifri, in which we brought the other place in the Torah where it mentions shatnez. In Deuteronomy 22, Lo tilbash shatnez tzemro fishtim yachtov. Unlike our parsha yesterday, in Deuteronomy it says it straight out, and it doesn't mention anything about kilayim. All it says is, you shall not wear shatnez, assuming we know what shatnez means, tzemer upishtim yachtov. But then in the very next verse, in verse 12, it says, Gedilim ta'aseloch, you shall make tassels on the four corners of the garment. Al arba kamfas ksusecha shetachasebo. The second verse, then, Rashi tells us, is an exception to the first verse. It is an exception. You are not allowed to wear tzemer or fishtim except when you put the tassels on your clothes. What does that mean? And modern commentators such as Milgram tells us that the rabbis are now pointing us through this wonderful midrashic trope of juxtaposition of one verse with the other. In fact, there are two separate commands. One is don't wear shatnez, and one is make tzitzis. But the fact that the tzitzis comes right after means that it is an exception to the rule of shatnez. Why the exception? So Milgram argues that shatnez is forbidden to Israelite commoners because it's reserved for the priestly castes. Remember, it's the Kohanim in the temple that must wear the royal purpurea, the garments of shatnez and wool, which represents royalty. But the commoners are not allowed to, except on their tzitzis, that one blue dye, sky blue thread that reminds every Jew that he has a smidgen of royalty. It's a conscious attempt by the Torah to encourage all Israelites to aspire to a degree of holiness comparable to that of the priests. I thought that was one of the best apologetics that we find in a modern commentator. Very nice. One midrash, however, which I want to focus on today, which is really my thesis that I'm coming to, is a medrash that I can share with you that comes from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. And that's the earliest place that I found it. Within our tradition, I will show you where else we find it. But if you can read with me, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, Perek Aleph, Loma hizharu Yisrael al shatnez. Here we have a very early witness. Why are we told about shatnez? This midrash traces the prohibition against shatnez to a strange story. Shehevi kayin moisa me'acholo klayot zerapishtin lekorban. Because if we go back in history to the primordial times of Cain and Havel, and we try to understand the original fratricide, the very first murder in the Bible. Remember, death had only come after the curse of Adam and Eve, because God had forewarned them, if you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will die. Death will be brought into the world. And we don't see it. They didn't die until after their long years. The very first time we see from death is the murder of Cain and Havel. And murder is on all our minds these last few weeks as we watch the wholesale slaughter of innocent civilians. Where does this murder come from in the human heart? I was thinking this week about the comparisons. I, in fact, asked my mother-in-law, she was alive in 1944 when they liquidated the Warsaw Ghetto block by block by block. And she knew that it was occurring. They read the New York Times, of course. And we are likewise watching this going block by block by block, standing by and helpless. And 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 where are we and where is God and all these questions. If we go back to that first murder in the Bible, it is connected to shatnez. Look at this. One midrash traces the prohibition against shatnez to the first murder. Why? Abel brings a korban of God, and Cain brings a korban. Cain brings from his food, klayot, zera, pishtin. He takes from one of those natural ingredients of shatnez, flax. Flax is not easy to come by. And he brings that as a korban to God. Vehevi hevel, mibchoros sono mechalveim kvasim shelo nigna samron. He brings from the choicest of his firstborn goats, sheep, and not only that, from the fat of the kvasim, before they were even sheep shorn, meaning they're young, the choicest of his sheep. Okay, well, what's the backstory to that? So if we read Pirkei de Rebbe Lezer, it carries on and says, Cain ohev lavod adama. Cain was a he loved to work the land. If I read from Alter, he says the following. The widespread culture founding story of rivalry between the herdsman and the farmer. The farmer is Cain. He's bringing from the farmland. The herdsman is Hevel. This is a recast in a pattern that will dominate the whole of Genesis, the displacement of the firstborn by the youngest son. If there is any other reason intimated as to why God would favor Abel's offering and not Cain's, it would be in the narrator's stipulation that Abel brings the very best of his flock. So we don't know why God preferred Cain, but he preferred Cain's. So so Cain gives from the best of he has, which is flax. Hevel brings from the best of what he has, which is the animal. Higia Yom Tov Shel Pesach. Now it comes to the Yom Tov of Pesach. Well, what do you have to do on Pesach? You have to bring a korban Pesach. Amalahem Adam Levonov Beleil Zeh. So Adam tells his boys on Pesach, Atidin Yisrael lahakriv korbanos psachim. In the future, Am Yisrael is going to bring a korban Pesach tonight. Hakrivu gamatem. Now you also bring in front of your God a korban. Hevi Cain Moshe Machol to Klayot Zera Pishtin. So Cain brings from what he has. He's a farmer. He's a farmer. So he takes from his crop. Vehevi Hevel mibchorosono. Hevel is a herdsman, so he brings from his. They both bring with the right intention to serve God and sacrifice. V'ni'atev minchas Cain, v'nirtzeis minchas Hevel. Pirkei de Rebbe Lezer tells us something very dark. One of them was accepted, and one of them was not accepted. Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha Omer, Omar Kadosh Baruch Hu. As a result of that conflict between Cain and Hevel, his was accepted, his was not. He was jealous, and he kills him, the first murder. God says, Al yit arvu minchas Cain vehevel olam. never the two shall meet. Forevermore, the korban that he brought, which is flax, and the korban that he brought, which is before it was shorn with wool from the goats or the sheep, never the two twain shall meet. Shema chas v'sholom yitarvu be'erek beged. Never again, as it says, lo tilba shatnes, you shall not wear shatnes. This is the connection between shatnes and the very first murder. Now, I want to end up with what really is the reason brought by the earliest Targumim. Pirkei de Rebbe Lezer is the 7th century. But in the Jerusalem Targum, if I can quote to you, the following. The Targum tries to fill out, and in the earliest translations, the story behind this premeditated murder. And one approach found in all the three Jerusalem Targum, which is late 1st century, presents the fight as a theological argument. A theological argument. Because we learned already in Breishis Rabbah that the argument was, hey man, you like to be a herdsman, I like to be a farmer, so you take all the cattle in the world and I'll take all the farm. But then an argument grew, because what's going to happen with the Beis HaMikdash? And so they're arguing about, well, the Beis HaMikdash is an exception. I also want to share that with you. That's one argument given. But let me quote from the Targum. The two had gone forth into the field, and Cain answered and said to Abel, I perceive that the world was created in goodness, but it is not governed according to the fruit of good works. For there is respect to persons in judgment. Therefore, it is that your offering was accepted and mine was not. He's complaining to Abel before he kills him. He's having a theological argument and says, look, the world may have been created in goodness, but this wasn't fair. And so Abel says to Cain, no, the world was created in goodness, and according to the fruit of good works is it governed. You must have done something wrong to deserve this, that your korban was not accepted. And Cain doubles down with the most famous apikorsische statement in rabbinics and says, Ani Cain va'amar lehevel. Cain answered Hevel, let din v'let dayan. There is neither judgment nor judge, nor this world, nor another world, nor good reward to the righteous, nor vengeance to the wicked. So Abel then gets killed and becomes the prototype of a martyr who dies for the profession of his faith. Cain is the prototype of the heretic, the Apikoros, Acher, who also, when he saw a father telling his child, go up the tree, get me that shiluach hakan, get me those eggs birds, those eggs, shoo away the mother bird, and the boy listens to the father to perform the mitzvah, the only two mitzvahs that are rewarded with long life, kabed es avicha and shiluach hakein, and he goes up and the branch breaks and he falls and he fractures his skull and he dies. And Acher, looking at that, says the same words, let din velet dayan. There is no priest and there is no God and there is no justice. Even so, the Targum does not present the killing as premeditated. The two brothers are engaging in a theological argument. Is there justice in the world? Cain then loses his temper, unable to accept that God rejected his offering for a good reason. And I think that these point their fingers to the Ribono Shel Olam. both them point the fingers, at least partially at fault, in the killing of Abel, because we are not told the reason why the Ribbono Shel Olam didn't accept it. And so there are two arguments as to for shatnez. The one argument is this was the first murder, and God is telling us, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, let me share with you one more time that text because it is so critical for my heretical reading today. Lefikach nesat semer ufishtin. The reason for the shatnez chok, a non-rational reason, I'm going to give you a rational reason. It is part of the order of creation. Shenema lo tilba shatnez. Why? Omar Kadosh Baruch Hu. Eino din sheyitarev minchas hachote im minchas hazakai. It is not appropriate that we should mix the offering of the sinner with the offering of the martyr. In this Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer, we have a very pious interpretation which focuses on the sin of fratricide, of murder, the very first murder in the Bible. For this, the shatnez comes to remind us of the very first murder and how we shouldn't mix the guilty with the innocent. Why? Yesh din v'yesh dayan. There is a moral order. There is a moral complexity to the world and a moral justice. So shatnez reminds us of that moral order. But the opposite could also be true. Don't mix the mincha of the chotev with the mincha of the zakai. Could be, don't remind me of my favoritism. That would be a heretical reading. That would combine the let din v'let dayan and the martyr with the perpetrator. That our lives, just like the shatnez, is not black and white. It's not good versus evil. As we can see in the human heart today, there is a darkness in the human heart that allows for the ongoing fratricide of one human to another, even though we're both created in the image of the divine. And that shatnez, for me, in a Jungian sense, represents both sides of the same coin. On the one side of the coin, Eino din sheyitarev minchasa, don't forget, there are perpetrators and there are victims, and the two should never be morally clouded. One must be brought to the criminal tribunal, and justice must prevail if this world is to continue. Children must not be slaughtered. On the other hand, it points back to the original fratricide and the whole setup of our moral universe, in which there is room to question what precipitated Cain's rage. His rage was precipitated by his rejection by the father figure, the divine, who rejected his offering. And why was that? Was the sweet-smelling flavor of the keves more sweet-smelling to the divine than pure flax? Those questions are also unanswered. And so it may be that Omar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, don't remind me of the shatnez. Don't remind me of this morally dubious universe that I set into motion. And I think that that is what we need to be able to hold, the moral clarity and the moral lack of clarity that infects the human heart. And may this suffering of these people be over soon, and may this clarity come back to being, and we should have a wonderful, wonderful week.